Good afternoon and welcome to this special broadcast. I am your host, Fifi Peters. In July, President Cyril Ramaphosa joined the UN Women in a dialogue that focused on the commitments that came from the Women's Conference in Beijing more than 20 years ago. Commitments were made at the conference around procurement, financial inclusion, and structure policies around gender-based violence. To achieve these commitments requires the support of corporate South Africa. And I am joined today by a panel of experts who will discuss principles driven under the umbrella of the UN Women that focus on uplifting women through partnerships. Let's meet our panel of experts. Good afternoon to you, ladies, and happy Women's Month, as we do, of course, celebrate the last day of Women's Month. And a special good afternoon, of course, to the Deputy Minister of Social Development. Ma'am, if you just allow me to begin with you. We're here to discuss uplifting women through partnerships, but I think perhaps a starting point is to understand where we are lifting these women from, given the effects that the pandemic has had on gender equality and the fact that many reports, ma'am, are saying that it's even taken us a step back in terms of the progress that we have made in trying to include a lot more women in society.
Thank you very much and good afternoon to all your viewers. And thank you to Old Michelle for the invitation. Well, you're lifting women from all sectors, from everywhere. That is very important because I think the assumption we always make is that you lift women that are much lower, but you also lift women that are us. You lift women that are CEOs, because in these positions, it does not mean that we've actually reached our potential. So every woman in whatever position that they are requires to be lifted. But also it's important for us to never forget the strategic partnerships that goes with lifting women. And I like making very basic examples. For example, the woman that is the domestic worker in my house also have children. And me and her must have a partnership that would enable her to assist me to become the deputy minister while looking after my children. But I must also show interest in her children as well-being and taking interest in understanding while she's raising my children, who is actually raising hers. And that is the uplifting that is important. It is all of us as women throughout our lives, we need to be uplifted.
I couldn't agree more, Deputy Minister. But Edith, perhaps you can give us the perspective of the corporate sector here in terms of the offtake at this moment in time of uplifting women. What's the base, given what has happened in the past year?
Yes, indeed. The COVID-19 pandemic has indeed brought some issues around leadership, and the vast inequality has been brought to bear, particularly on the African continent where we are. In these times, as leaders, our decisions, how we make decisions, especially surrounding our teams, leadership, support, creating an enabling environment for diversity and inclusion, more especially in these challenging times. Last year at this time, there was a lot of talk or issues that we saw in terms of how well certain nations did in managing the pandemic, for example. Nations that had females at their helm were doing really well, did quite well to navigate around the pandemic itself. And the insight was clear at that time. In both the government space as well as in the private sector, female leaders were excelling. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that in 2021, the number of women that are running some Fortune 500 as well as Global 500 businesses has hit all-time highs. 41 from 37 in 2020, and 23 right now from 14 in 2020. And as we engage today, the topic that we're engaging on, the aim is not to elevate females at the expense of males, no. It is a position, an engagement around how do we support each other for the betterment of our entire world. In my view, this gender is actually above other, is actually not for at all. Quality leadership entails that as leaders, we carry on with the genders to be able to support them, to understand the issues that are faced by women in the workplace and how fellow women can support them, just as men can support them to enable them perform better in the workplace. At Old Mutual, our objective is very clear. We are trying to build a workforce that is very representative of the markets that we are operating in, and where each employee has a very deep sense of belonging. And we are focused on 5 key areas: gender equality, gender identity, ethnicity, people with disabilities, and age. And the focus areas are addressed through various interventions that are focused on building inclusive leaders throughout our management.
All right, we'll go back to Edith in just a moment. We're still living in the times when, unfortunately, technology does sometimes take over and does its own thing. But Anne, it is good to catch up with you technologically, virtually, as it were. And ma'am, we're having a conversation as we're wrapping up Women's Month here in South Africa, and it is a conversation that is based on commitments that were made at that all-important UN conference in Beijing all those many years ago. Perhaps allow us to take a step back with you and just reflect from your view of, the pandemic and the effects that it has had on women, and what we should be doing as we try to chart our way forward.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to you and to all our panelists. Well, first and foremost, let me just start by saying that indeed we had a big global reflection on where we've come from since Beijing. And we found that indeed we've made progress in some areas. Girls' education, maternal mortality, less discriminatory laws. So there are some areas where we've made progress, but we're lagging in other many, many, many areas. And so UN Women has led an initiative called the Generation Equality Campaign, where we hosted 2 forums that are designed to try to drive for real transformational change in ways that can fast track and accelerate what we've all been trying to do on gender equality, and identified 6 areas that are the ones that are lagging the most behind: gender-based violence, economic justice, climate justice, sexual and reproductive health and rights, in the technology and innovation. These areas, women, peace and security, are areas that we recognized that despite all the efforts, we still have so much further to go. And so as we look at these and as we speak to you and we speak to the economy, we know that in every one of these areas, an inclusive economy is crucial. And the way in which corporates and governments and partners have to respond has got to be really with such seriousness. We can no longer tinker at the edges in terms of gender equality. If a company is annual revenue is, 72 billion, we know that easily 30-40% of that comes from their procurement of goods and services. 50% of that minimum should come from women-owned businesses. That is transformational. We know that when companies have 40 to 50% more women in their businesses, that the companies perform better. They have better revenues, better returns, but they have also better incomes in society. So it's really about calling all of us to action to say, this is no longer an option for us to tinker at the edges, for us to just do tokenism when it comes to women's economic empowerment. But real justice means that we're investing in women because they are really the engines of our economies and driving that hard in every single one of these areas that I talked about.
Mandisa, I stumbled upon some research that said that, I mean, in economic downturns, women are traditionally the hardest hit by slipping of the economy, and we have seen that happen in the past year or so. And what this report was saying in terms of argument was that, you know, when we do have economic downturns, agendas relating to inclusion and perhaps even the advancement or uplifting of women tend to fall further down the list of, you know, mission critical things to do. In your experience in the past year within your stakeholder relations, what do you think attitudes towards uplifting women have been, and have we regressed or are we still on track?
Thanks, Fifi. Such a pertinent question for this month and for this conversation. I think those statistics for me are always enhanced by the fact that as the African continent, the last MasterCard study on financial inclusion shows that half of the African continent is financially excluded as a base. And when we look at where women fall in terms of that exclusion, that contrast is even more stark. And so as a financial services organization, our mission is financial inclusion and to drive financial inclusion as far as possible, particularly for women who have been disenfranchised and don't have access to some of the kinds of services that we would hope that all of our African people have access to, but women as a large constituency of that population. And so in terms of some of the partnership work we've done, it's not work that we've recently embarked upon, but I'm going to share just some of the work that we've been doing with our partners over the years in attempts to ensure that women are included. About 5 years ago, we entered into a relationship with the then Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, which has since become DALAD, to drive support to women entrepreneurs in the agricultural space. That's a partnership that we've maintained for over 5 years now, and we're very deliberate about finding women who are operating in the agri sector and ensuring that those women get recognition and they get access to the kinds of services that will allow them to continue to grow their businesses, that they get the kind of training that's required, and they're able to be contributors in the economy. We know that the agri sector on the African continent absorbs a large portion of the population, and when women are in those businesses, it's important because they're driving financial inclusion in the places where they are, but they are also contributing towards food security, which is another pertinent issue. And so we deliberate about building that relationship with the department. And at the moment, we are currently in discussions with them to see how we can further that partnership to include a technological component so that we're also able to address this issue of the digital divide, particularly in sectors like agri, where the digital divide can often be underlooked. GBV is another one of the areas where we have been very deliberate to partner. You will remember that at the end of last year, President Ramaphosa created a fund specifically targeting GBV and addressing GBV, and we proudly contributed towards that fund as part of continuing to drive the efforts and initiatives towards curbing the scourge and what has been called the second pandemic, as it were. We also work closely with the Deputy Minister in her capacity heading up social development to ensure that we reach out to women through her forums and through her platforms. In fact, as recently as last week, we partnered on a webinar where she was reaching out to widows and orphans about how they navigate life after losing a loved one, a topical theme in these times. One of our senior financial advisors was able to participate in that forum to give legal and financial advice in terms of how women navigate the pandemic. We know on the African continent in particular that the way in which women can be treated culturally after the loss of the loved one can often further exclude them. And so we've been very deliberate to try and avail those resources, and we're proud to maintain our relationship with Nsan and UN Women as we continue to advocate for generation equality. So those are just a few. but they are diverse. As Edith mentioned, we have the 5 principles as well, organizationally. But for us, it's really to maintain an internal focus on the women within Old Mutual, but also to ensure that that focus doesn't stop us from being active and deliberate outside of Old Mutual, to ensure that we leverage the resources that we have to continue uplifting women through our very deliberate partnerships with our external stakeholders.
All right. Deputy Minister, ma'am, if I can just come back to you, because let's talk partnerships. Last week, we all received the shocking statistics here in South Africa regarding unemployment and what had been happening in that space. And a lot of job losses in our second quarter, and a lot of those job losses, unfortunately, being experienced by women, ma'am. And then there's also the issue of what the pandemic has given rise to, the increase in gender-based violence that I imagine that your department has also had to contend with the increase in demand for social support. So when you're looking, when government is looking at this situation, ma'am, the shocking unemployment statistics that have fallen more hardly on women, and in fact black women, if we're frank, and also the rise in GBV, what kind of partnerships are needed, Deputy Minister, to change the situation?
I think the partnerships that we needed, firstly, one of the very strong partnerships we have is definitely with our host, the Old Mutual Foundation, as already said. We managed to bring in a sector that actually is a very important sector, which is the traditional leaders, because whether we like it or not, all of us come from somewhere to come to Johannesburg to look for the gold. And we made sure that rural women are actually benefiting from the COVID interventions. And that was amongst the amazing work that we do with them. But let me say also, that work was done under strategic partnerships, because as government, in particular as the Department of Social Development, we can never do it alone. I always simplify it to leave just a thought in South Africa's heads. The Department of Health gives us the statistics of who passed on and give us the numbers, but the people that put a face to those numbers is this department. For every South African that has lost their jobs, either through the South Africa unrest, they come back to social development. So we need to make sure that families have food, but we don't have the kind of money. We need to make sure that those who are victims of gender-based violence have shelters to go to, that they have counseling, that they are prepared for court. And at the same time, the very department, we also cannot only support the victim, we also have an obligation to ensure that the perpetrator is also supported. And it's a lot of work, I don't want to lie, but strategic partnerships with different companies. We run the command center, for an example. All the telecoms have zero rated it so that nobody is unable to access our 0800 428 428 number, that every South African can access it. And that is through partnership. We continue to feed South Africans. We continue to make the 350s available to poor South Africans. We need to create the jobs. All of us, the private sector, government. And what we're doing as a department, we're trying to guide companies such as Old Mutual, for an example, to say, start using some of your corporate social responsibility or investment money to fund cooperatives and recognize them as businesses in your actually procurement, because half the time they'll tell you, no, we can't support cooperatives. No, they are too much work. No, they are not on our central databases. And as a department, we say when it's mass-based, actually more families. And a lot of the cooperatives are actually run and established by women. So in all of, whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's strategic partnerships, whether it's creating the jobs, whether it's job losses, we need each other as individuals more than we need a corporate, because it is your neighbor that is hungry. So my call is, the African Ubuntu idiom is needed to navigate COVID more than ever before.
And it has been encouraging to see that African spirit of Ubuntu was demonstrated throughout the pandemic. I mean, we can argue about whether we could have collaborated a lot more, but it's good to see that we can work together when we're required to do so. Edith, for the most part so far, we've just been painting a picture of how the South African woman has fared in this time. But can you give us the perspective from your side of town? And how you're thinking as C-suite individuals around the disproportionate effect of the pandemic on women in the workplace?
Thank you, Fifi. Indeed, COVID-19 has placed an equal burden, a heavy burden on the African women. The care that women traditionally have been giving in the society, but with COVID coming in, it has actually impacted them more, and especially at a point where there has been a loss of job, with more women leaving the labor market than men during the pandemic. One of the issues that we see is that the longer that this higher burden on women lasts, the more that the impact will actually be with us for a long time, because it actually reverses the gains that we have made over the years. We have been developing and ensuring that we have more representation of women across the various levels of management in the private sector as well as in the public sector. If they leave now, most of them will leave permanently. The gains that we've made, we will actually retrogress, and it will actually take us quite a long time to get back. So far, I think governments as well as the private sector have done some significant investments. I will take an example of what we're doing in Old Mutual in the education sector, trying to ensure that we invest in the girl child to actually be ready to take on challenging roles in the commercial world. We have an initiative with the Zuzu University in Malawi, where we have an Olympiad, a math Olympiad, which challenges not just the girl child, but even boys to actually compete and excel in mathematics. We have seen out of this initiative over the years, and this is an initiative that has been carried out for quite some time, that most of these that excel through this are becoming leaders in other sectors of our society. At this point, we all need to make decisions, take policy decisions that ensures that we are not retrogressing, we are not losing out the female representation where we had already started making gains. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, I've been talking to you for some time now, and we often, speak with you and reach out to you for your expertise during Women's Month or for women's related issues. And you mentioned something regarding, we can't afford to tinker around the efforts and the initiatives that need to be done any longer. And I suppose, one can interpret that as saying, we have been tinkering before the pandemic. But what kind of call to action then is needed in the areas that the UN Women has identified as being important? You mentioned technology and climate change and gender-based violence and economic justice amongst the few. What kind of interventions are needed, and what have you seen on the ground so far regarding the will to do what needs to be done?
Thank you so much, Fifi. I would say that, if we look at each one of these areas, we've actually spent quite a bit of time trying to focus on what could be really transformational for an economy. Let me take the issue of economic justice. So many women lost their jobs during COVID-19, and this is not unique to South Africa, it's a global issue. But, as we think always about resuscitating the economy or recovery in the economy, the investment tends to turn to what is viewed as the as the high value sector. So infrastructure, mining, and different high value sectors where women are not in most instances. South Africa did a study on if they employed a woman for every child that needs care, and I'm sure Deputy Minister will confirm this, that South Africa could create between 1.3 to 2.2 million jobs in the early child development sector. So just the way we think about inclusivity is one of the things that needs to change. The way we think about growth is one of the areas that we really need to think differently. So if we want to create new jobs, we can create new jobs, but in the sectors that really where women sit, where women don't need to have high level skills and their barriers to entry are minimized. And so this is one where not only are you providing, enabling women to get back into work because childcare is sorted, you're making sure children are taken care of, but you're also creating enterprises and jobs in the early child development space. So that's one big area that is under discussion, and there's a global alliance on care that South Africa is part of. The other thing is to look at the areas, and we've been talking a lot about this issue of preferential procurement. Just yesterday, we were having a conversation with the Limpopo government and with a district municipality. And if you look at what the spend is of this municipality on procurement, it's 1.6 billion every year. If 40% of that goes into women's hands, that is 640 million rand every year that should go into women-owned businesses. But when you do an analysis of who has been getting the businesses, women are barely at 2% of that. And yet we have seen some municipalities, and we have a municipality, Amatole district in the Eastern Cape, who were able to, in a 6-month period, move from 4% to 40% in terms of focusing and investing on women. But you see, Fifi, my point here is this. Unless you are deliberately going out and saying, where are the women businesses, working in partnership with women's business associations, with the women's cooperatives in that municipality, and finding them and connecting them to the opportunities. Very often women don't even know what the information is. You know, when we're redistributing land, very often women don't even know that there's a redistribution of land. They're too busy just trying to get food on the table for tomorrow. Let's go to the corporates themselves. And Old Mutual is one. I mean, Old Mutual is obviously a company that does great investments in this area. But we have a global initiative that we call the Women Empowerment Principles, which is part of the UN Global Compact. There are 7 principles that every single company that signs up, we have 85 companies in South Africa that are signatories. These companies then commit to investing in gender equality in these 7 areas. The first is about gender parity, and many companies focus on that. And there's a lot of tokenism, but yes, some companies have done well. I think Old Mutual is at about 42%, which is great in terms of women in leadership, right? But once we do that, how do we translate that into real lives? Violence and harassment in the world of work. There's a new convention out from ILO since 2019 that is really pushing to ensure that violence and harassment in the workplace is history. It's a major issue for many women who experience this in the workplace. Gender pay gap. I think this is an issue we've spoken about, Fifi, before. On the issue of gender pay gap, it has become so normalized that, you know, as we do our HR practice, what do? We ask for the history. We say, show me your old pay slip. When you show me your old pay slip and you ask that of women, it doesn't take notice of the fact that there's what we call the motherhood penalty. Many women have had to take time off work to look after their children. They fall behind in terms of their earning power, but also they enter in lower paying jobs in most companies. And so they always are moving at a slower pace behind men. And so if you're recruiting a woman at a CEO position, don't ask her for her history. Remunerate her at the level that you remunerate anybody else at the CEO level, any man that would enter at that level. Forget her history. Even if it's a huge jump, she qualifies for that position, pay her for that. So it's really a question of changing what has become so normalized in discriminatory practice that it's almost not recognized. And then we must have equity practices in the companies. So we have to have, real training, real preparation. When we say 40% of procurement has to come from women-owned businesses, it means, first of all, the finance officers, the procurement officers have to be retrained because they're used to playing this game with the old boys club. They resuscitate the same people. Right? So challenge them to start looking for women and then work with the women and invest in the women so that they can actually supply those goods and services to that company. Mm-hmm. So it's not an easy game. It's not one that will come automatically. It comes from commitment at the top. And Fifi, we have our global He for She program. That He for She initiative, we have impact champions who are CEOs of companies. In South Africa, we have De Beers, we've had Standard Bank, we have Absa Bank. We have companies who commit from the top, and we hold them responsible to change the game. The president of Iceland made the commitment that by 2022, any company found to have unequal pay will be tried as a criminal case. It is illegal to have unequal gender pay. And that's come from our He for She impact champions. So, give them real commitments that they are forced to change at a personal level in terms of how they run the companies. So there's many different initiatives that we work with.
No, that one is a really important one regarding pay. And I think that it's certainly a lesson that I'd like to be learned by many other countries. Whether it's necessary to be as punitive is a debate, but I mean, definitely it's an action that is showing a serious effort to curb the prominence of unequal pay. But just on that, and on the point that you did make around quotas and measuring success, Mandisa, perhaps you can come in here, because when we talk about your stakeholder buy-in, and perhaps maybe more specifically the initiatives that Old Mutual sponsors in the space to uplift women, how do you measure the impact and how do you measure the success of your efforts?
Thank you, FIFA. I think quotas is an interesting one. Someone said something to me the other day that really stuck out, and they said, every time we say that we are requiring 30% representation of women, or we're requiring 40% representation for women, we're actually still allowing for the rest of the representation to not be women. Yeah. And it was the first time that I thought about the quota system in that fashion. And it's changed the way that I see quotas. I am not saying that quotas are not important. I think it's hugely significant. I think as we continue to shift the dial and push ourselves to put in place those targets, we're able to see the growth. But I also hope that we as women are learning to challenge the boundaries and to push beyond the quotas, because just because the requirement says we'd like to see 30% or we'd like to see 40%, we actually would like to see more percentages. We don't want to limit women to participate within a 30% or a 40%. I'm sure Ms. Anne would like to see us sitting at 50% or 60% where possible. And it's the environments in which we're operating that make the spaces conducive. So that was just an insight that I experienced this week about quotas, which made me just think about the way that I respond to quotas. And when I see quotas in place, because I think sometimes the challenge is when you get to 40%, you think, well, we've made it. There's the sense we need to pat ourselves on the back. Well, actually, we've made it to the threshold that's required for the season. We should be pushing beyond boundaries in order to see ourselves really having a favorable representation across the board. And I think that's been a personal challenge for me. And it's definitely something that I'm going to be carrying through into my interactions throughout our engagements around quotas across the board. In terms of measuring success, Fifi, and coming back specifically to your question around how we measure success, we measure success through access in most instances. If we're looking at how we as an organization are performing from the point of view of procurement, which is one of the examples that Ms. Anne made, we would go and look at the number of small businesses, the number of women that have been empowered, the amount of money that's been generated by those businesses as a result of being on our system. That's a numerical calculation. When we do work with stakeholders such as Deputy Deputy Minister, for instance, we look at households and the number of households that we've been able to reach with food security initiatives, and how many households have been impacted, or how many households we've been able to ensure are not impacted adversely by the fact that there is no food available, or in the current context of the recent unrest, we look at how many small businesses have been impacted and how many small businesses' doors have closed as a result of the unrest that was experienced recently in South Africa. And we don't stop at the business or counting the businesses. We look at the number of jobs that business was sustaining. We look at the number of employees that were in the organization. We then generally would do a calc based on the number of employees and the kind of impact that one job would have in its respective community. And that's how we measure broadly the reach of our initiatives. So we start with the numbers, but the numbers give us the KPI. They don't actually give us the impact. The impact is how we've been able to make a change as a result of the one person that's been impacted. So if we were able to give one Black-owned woman business, how many people does she employ? How many people receive income from that? How many people are beneficiaries of that income? And overall, as a result of being able to finance that person or being able to give that person a contract, how much impact have we made in our society? So that's generally our impact model. And we find that it's much more comprehensive than purely looking at the hard numbers or the hard KPIs that we track. Not because it's not important to track the hard KPIs, but to the point that have been made by the speakers before me, it's important for us as corporates to be deliberate about having an impact on society. And so the scorecard is really the start of the impact tracking process. It's about following where that money has gone, what it's done in society, and how it's changed the trajectories of people as a function of being able to go out there and make a difference. So that's what our framework looks like. And that's why when we work with stakeholders, we try to stay with them. We try to stay the course with them. Through our Old Mutual Partnership Awards, for instance, when we identify winners, we don't just sign the check and give them the prize money. We want to know what the prize money did. We want to know how it increased productivity. We want to know how many jobs it created. And we want to know how many people those jobs were able to benefit in communities, so that we can continue to invest in the initiatives that have the most impact on the lives of our stakeholders and our communities.
It is an interesting framework. I agree with you, and I also agree with the perspective that you have introduced regarding, how to look at quotas differently, because I can also see that level of fatigue, or perhaps putting your feet up once you do reach, for instance, the 30% threshold of woman inclusivity, when, there is room to do more. So perhaps in that instance, quotas are not always the best things to use, but I imagine that they are a start. Deputy Minister, if I can just explore your mind and your thinking around partnerships even further, ma'am, because I'm sure that you will agree that ultimately the ideal scenario is having fewer people, fewer South Africans, fewer women, fewer men on social grants of all forms, and more of them in some form of economic opportunity. And I'd like to find out from your experience, your background in technology, and just where this economy is going and the world is going with the rapid increase of digitalization and the real threat that ladies and young girls and women will be left behind with this digital divide that could grow. How is government thinking around fostering such partnerships within your own corridors to prevent this happening, and to perhaps ensure further upliftment of young girls and young women within your respective corridors, ma'am?
Let me start by also acknowledging what Anne was saying around early childhood development. As the custodian of children, but also of the Early Childhood Development Service, it's very true. There is one sector that can actually create a lot of the jobs. And you would be aware that with COVID, that was the first thing we closed. And with it closed the food for the children, and the rest is history. But we will always be grateful to the contribution that Old Mutual has made to enable us to open some of the ECDs, especially in deepest rural areas. with our partnership with traditional leaders. I think it's very important that the issues around social security it's in itself has where we need as a department to connect grant recipients to sustainable livelihoods. And a lot of that activity of connecting our social grant recipients to sustainable livelihoods, that's where the partnerships become even more important. The highest number of our grant recipients at the moment, without the 350, just on the everyday grants, we're paying 13.8 million South Africa's children who are on a child support grant because nobody in that family is working. We're not going to talk about older persons, but we're also going to talk about disabled people, because it's important that we never forget that when we talk about integration, access to services, we also need to disaggregate the data further, because in that are rural women, in that are disabled women, in that are widows, in that amongst ourselves as women, we have our own little pockets in terms of classifications, but also a lot of reasons. As a visually impaired woman in government, I cannot do my work without technology, because I need technology to be able to be at the same level as my peers. I need to read, which obviously my eyes doesn't. But when somebody talks about technology, I always say it's a nice word, but until technology reaches the woman that sits day in, day out, through the rain, through the sun, at her table, selling one thing or the other, it means we have not actually made the cut. Whether it is her having the little machine where we can all swap and pay her without high bank charges for the oranges or the cabbage or the traditional attire that she sells, technology would still leave women out. And I'm using those examples because one of the lessons is that the first thing when we talk about technology, we talk about access to the computers, access to internet, access to all of those. Yes, we do roll out a lot of computer labs in rural areas through our partnership with MTN SA Foundation, and distribute a lot of devices to women in business, but women in small businesses. And that is beginning to show results, because they are beginning to be able to know that through my phone, actually, I can be paid through an e-wallet, instant money and all of that, that I can see immediately. If we can close that particular gap in technology, and that's the discussion even with us in social development, with us in the social security space, where majority of our grant recipients are women and young women, is how do we use technology to actually bring down the queues that we all get to witness? Why is it that people must still queue for any social development service? Be it seeing a social worker to get one report or the other. Why can't they request it through email and a social worker is able to actually compile the report, and that widow who must go to the master's office can get that letter and go and demand? So it is real. And the digital divide it needs to be closed so that women are able to do what they need to do. Whether it's a washing machine, that must be simplified. I was saying to my friend yesterday, actually, who visited me, like, yo, Miguel, so what happens when your housekeeper is not here? I'm like, yo, I'm a stranger in my own house, because now my microwave is touchscreen, so I'll eat cold food. My washing machine is touch, my stove is touch. As a blind woman, technology has disadvantaged me in my own home. And that is the lens that we need to look at when we talk about technology. it should be also to say, how do we enable women to function and have these assistive devices that can enable them to actually be productive, be able to supervise the homework while the washing machine is running. And that is becoming more agent and real now, as a lot of women have lost their jobs. And as a virtue, domestic workers who used to look after their children. So the job losses are very, very high. But also, technology in itself disadvantages women. And I can say that because our agency, for example, SASA, we no longer employing anyone because now we've got the electronic application system, so people talk to the system. And those are vacancies of grant administrators that we are never going to be able to fill because we are now perfecting the technology, and South Africans are getting onto the bandwagon. It's a good thing, but it's also not necessarily the best. So we need to take technology and look at it from all angles, at all levels, for everything.
And to bring you back here, the issue on the digital divide, crowding in a little bit more investments in the space. What do you think it's going to take? But also, I'd like to ask, I mean, in the event that we have seen, you know, not enough investments being channeled into early childhood development, and that right now governments are positioning infrastructure as the way forward to recover all over the world from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that a lot of the jobs will be in the space. Is the onus also perhaps not on us women to see how we can reskill or upskill ourselves to be relevant in spaces that will perhaps do the most hiring and pay the most in this time?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, when you speak about inequity and, you know, equality and equity, you know, it's not that many women don't want to be in spaces where there's higher value, but there is discrimination even in the way, you know, in access, in opportunity, in education. So let me start there. But let me talk about the digital divide a little bit. And to say that, you know, for us, technology and innovation was placed as one of the 6 action coalition areas to accelerate action because, you know, and this is even before COVID, but COVID exacerbated it because we realize now how important it is for children to go to school because of, you know, using technology, and how important it is for women to be able to access their businesses, marketing and sales through their phones. But what we've seen is that historically, women in general across Africa have accessed about 30% less access to technology than men. We also know that every country in the world has a requirement to set aside a levy from the telcos for internet and technology access to be able to reduce that digital divide. But what we found, and we did a study as UN Women in 2018, I think, with the World Wide Web Foundation. And in this study, we looked across Africa and we found that countries are sitting with over $400 to $500 million that are not spent, that could be spent on enhancing connectivity. So if there's one thing we could be doing is making sure that every municipal market, for instance, where women sit, has technology, has a hotspot. And, you know, we now have, you know, bricks and other creative ways in which we can create connectivity. If every school, every neighborhood that needs connectivity has and is prioritized, we can actually afford to invest in that. And that's just from the universal service agencies of countries. But if we then partner with with the big technology companies, we can do way more. Again, I really feel that a lot of companies do well, but it's never enough. It has to be significant. It has to be bold. It has to be actually revolutionary from these companies to take the decision that we are going to connect the entire country. We're going to connect every woman and every child to the digital networks. It's possible to do. We have the resources to do it, but somehow, we're so happy to celebrate a small connection and a small project here and there. This is not about projects. It's about ensuring that everybody's connected. Once everybody's connected, then we can have women connecting to these opportunities and to technical skills that they need. And I do know that there are many initiatives that are connecting girls to STEM. We've been working on a program called African Girls Can Code. There are multiple programs that are working, with this government, I believe social development itself, who've been working with young girls to get them more connected to technology opportunities. Yeah. Science and STEM, there's a lot of initiatives along that space to be able to push and invest more and more and more.
All right, Mandisa, just your contribution to the discussion around the digital divide and perhaps how we should be looking at it differently to ensure certainly that no woman of any ability or disability, as it were, is left behind here.
I think Ms. Anne's laid a fantastic foundation in her response, and it's absolutely that. It's not just access to technology, but it's actual inclusion. And in our world, it's financial inclusion. We, about a year ago, at the height of the pandemic, were able to launch our WhatsApp communicator, which allowed our customers to be able to facilitate their claims entirely through the WhatsApp process, because that is the most used tool in South Africa. If you don't have access to that kind of technology, you don't have the luxury to have connectivity to data, for instance, you don't benefit from the access that's been created for you. So it's the digital divide, as I see it, is it's fantastic in the sense that the digital divide is not fantastic. Rather, what the digital divide has done is that it showed us that the tools that technology has availed to us are fantastic for inclusion, and they are fantastic for driving change. However, if you don't have access to those tools, then you remain excluded, and we're not able to bring you in. And I think the investments on the part of the public sector remain critical here, but also the role of the private sector in terms of being able to support that. And to Ms. Anne's point, it's not the projects that are going to get us there, but it's a comprehensive effort with us all coming together as the members of the social compact and saying this is a priority that we need to drive, not only to service our customers, not only to ensure that our kids are able to log on to their classes and continue to benefit from the education system that enables them, but rather to look at it as a way of fast tracking our economies as the African continent. Because if we're not able to jump on this bandwagon, so to speak, it's going to have incredible consequences in the long run, not only on women, but on our economies broadly. And I think we've got an opportunity at this particular point to leapfrog some of the old technology that was invested previously. They used to say that we as Africa had a fantastic opportunity to not install telephone lines all over the continent as many continents did. We've got the luxury of now moving straight into the mobile phone era. But even then, that luxury is only available to the extent that we're able to tap in and leverage the technology that's been made available, and not just tap in and access it as the 10% and the 20%, but really make sure that access is granted across the board and that people are given the opportunity to participate inclusively in the economy. And you can see the impact that mobile money has already made. It's transformed banking completely. If there's anything that's shifted the dial on financial inclusion on the African continent, it's been, the use of that kind of mobile technology. And going forward, even when we look at the provision of social services, access to education, access to being able to submit one's grant application, for instance, as the Deputy Minister was saying, it's all going to be driven and fueled by technology. And so there is this big responsibility on ourselves as the members of the Social Compact to come together and ensure that this is something that we deliver on, not just for the haves, but for all of society, because our economic well-being as a continent ultimately depends on it.
Certainly. Edith, I understand that we have you back. Would you like to just pick up on your your last thoughts as we wrap up this conversation, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I was saying to the minister's point, partnerships with the private sector and working through cooperatives are indeed a way to go, because you also have a way to reach out to numbers at the same time. We have an organization right here in Malawi working with members of the community. They were looking at a business idea of getting markets, accessing markets from members of a community. What they found out was whilst the markets were there, were open, most of the decision makers around what the financing or the revenues out of this regu market was, to the decisions to be made were to be made by men. What AICC did was to say, let's pull together these women in cooperatives, 12,000 of them, get them access to markets. And as Old Mutual, we have worked with these women. We have tried to also empower them with financial education and the impact that it has.
I think that unfortunately the line, not our friend for today, but certainly a message delivered regarding the upliftment of women. And I think that, you know, as we reflect on the conversations that we do have regarding inclusive growth, perhaps a stronger message needs to be sent to the gatekeepers that this is inclusive growth for all. I do wonder to what degree we have seen a lack of progress when it does come to women inclusion in all aspects of the economy, whether that has been as a result of fear that perhaps we're advancing women at the expense of men. But I think that message was quite clearly communicated by the panel, that it's not advancing for one at the expense of other. It's let's grow inclusively and let's all grow inclusively. But unfortunately, we have run out of time on this last day of Women's Month here in South Africa. To all the ladies that are watching, I hope you have a rest or a great day further. And also to all the men that you're watching, I look forward to a lot more interventions on your part in advancing the upliftment of us all from this COVID-19 pandemic and the growth of our economies. From myself, Fifi Peters, and of course here at CNBC Africa, thanks for watching, and we'll do it again next time. Goodbye.